Hello everyone, now let us discuss about Good Manufacturing Practices Guide for Active Pharmaceutical Ingredients, Part 5. This comes under Q7 Quality Guideline of ICH. Here we will be discussing about documentation and records. Documentation system and specifications. All documents related to the manufacture of intermediates or APIs should be prepared, reviewed and approved and distributed according to written procedures. Such documents can be in paper or electronic form. The issuance, revision, superseding, withdrawal of all documents should be controlled with maintenance of revision histories. A procedure should be established for retaining all appropriate documents. For example, developmental history reports, scale-up reports, technical transfer reports, process validation reports, training records, production records, control records, and distribution records. And the retention periods for these documents should also be specified. All production, control and distribution records should be retained for at least 1 year. All production, control and distribution records should be retained for at least 1 year after the expiry date of the batch. For APS with retest dates, records should be retained for at least 3 years after the batch is completely distributed. When entries are made in records, these should be made intelligibly in spaces provided for such entries directly after performing the activities and should identify the person making the entry. Corrections to entries should be dated, signed, and leave the original entry still readable. And during the retention period, originals or copies of records should be readily available at the establishment where the activities described in such records occurred. Records can be promptly retrieved from another location by electronic or other means or by any other means are acceptable. Specifications, instructions, procedures and records can be retained either as originals or as true copies such as photocopies, microfilm or other accurate reproductions of the original records. Where reduction techniques such as microfilming or electronic records are used, suitable retrieval equipment and a means to produce a hard copy should also be readily available. Specifications should be established and documented for raw materials, intermediates where necessary, APIs and labeling and packing materials. In addition, specifications may be appropriate for certain other materials, such as process aids, gaskets, or other materials used during the production of the intermediates or APIs that could critically impact on the quality. Acceptance criteria should be established and documented for the in-process controls. If electronic signatures are used on documents, they should be authenticated and secure. Coming to equipment cleaning and use record. Records of major equipment use, cleaning, sanitization and or sterilization and maintenance should show the date, time, if appropriate, product and batch number of each batch processed in the equipment and the person who performed the cleaning and maintenance. If the equipment is dedicated to manufacturing one intermediate or API, then individual equipment records are not necessary. If batches of the intermediates or API follow a trackable sequence. In cases where dedicated equipment is employed, the records of cleaning, maintenance and use can be part of batch record or maintained separately. Now coming to the records of raw materials, intermediates, API labeling and packaging material. Records should be maintained including the name of the manufacturer, identity and quantity of each shipment of each batch of raw materials, intermediates or labeling and packing material for APIs. The name of the supplier control number if known or other identification number the number allocated on receipt, and date of receipt, the results of any test or examination performed, and the conclusion derived from this, records tracing the use of materials, and the documentation of examination and review of API labeling and packaging material for conformity with established specifications, and the final decision regarding the rejected raw materials, intermediates or API labeling and packaging material. Master labels or simply approved labels should be maintained for comparison to issued labels. Master labels should be maintained for comparison to issued labels. Coming to master production instruction. Master production and control records. To ensure uniformity from batch to batch, master production instructions for each intermediate or API should be prepared, dated and signed by one person and independently checked, dated and signed by a person in the quality unit. Master production instruction should include the name of the intermediate or API being manufactured and an identifying document reference code if applicable, a complete list of raw materials and intermediate designated by names or codes sufficiently specific to identify any special quality characteristics, an accurate statement of the quantity or ratio of each raw material or intermediate to be used, including the unit of measure. Where the quantity is not fixed, the calculations for each batch size or rate of production should be included. Variations to quantity should be included where they are justified. The production location and major production equipment to be used. Detailed production instructions, including the sequence to be followed, ranges of process parameters to be used, sampling instructions and in-process controls with their acceptance criteria when appropriate, wherever appropriate, time limits for completion of individual processing steps and or the total process where appropriate, expected yield ranges at appropriate phases of the processing or time, where appropriate, special notations and precautions to be followed or cross-references to these, and the instructions for storage of intermediates or API to assure its suitability for use, including the labeling and packaging materials, and special storage conditions with time limits where appropriate. Coming to batch production records, batch production and control records. Batch production record should be prepared for each intermediate and API and should include complete information relating to the production and control of each batch. The batch production record should be checked before issual to assure that it is a correct version and a legible, accurate reproduction of the appropriate master production instruction. If the batch production record is produced from a separate part of the master document, that document should be included as reference to the current master production instruction being used. And these records should be numbered with a unique batch or identification number, dated and signed when issued. In continuous production, the product code together with the date and time can serve as a unique identifier until the final number is allocated. Documentation of completion of each significant step in the batch production records should be documented and should include date and when appropriate times, identity of major equipment, for example, reactors, dryers, mills, etc. used, specific identification of each batch, including the weights, measures, and batch numbers of raw materials, intermediates, or any reprocessed material used during the manufacturing, actual results recorded from critical process parameters, any sampling performed, signatures of the person performing and directly supervising or checking each critical step in the operation. The documentation of completion of each significant step in the batch production record should include these following things. In-process and laboratory test results, this is a continuation. Actual yield at appropriate phases or times. Description of packing and label for intermediate or API. Representative label of API or intermediate if made commercially available. Any deviation noted, its evaluation, investigation conducted if appropriate, or reference to that investigation if stored separately, and results of release testing. Written procedure should be established and followed for investigating critical deviations or the failure of a batch of intermediate or API to meet the specifications. The investigation should extend to other batches that may have been associated with the specific failure or deviation. Coming to laboratory control records. Laboratory control records should include complete data derived from all tests conducted to ensure the compliance with established specifications and standards, including examinations and essays, as follows. A description of samples received for testing, including the material name or source, batch number or other distinctive code, the date when the sample was taken, where appropriate, the quantity and date of sample was received for testing, a statement of or reference to each test method used, a statement of the weight or measure of sample used for each test as described by the method, data on or cross-reference to the preparation of and testing of reference standards, reagents, and standard solutions. A statement of weight or measure of the sample used for each test as described by the method, data on or cross-reference to the preparation of testing of reference standards, reagents, and standard solutions. A complete record of all raw data generated during each test, in addition to graphs, charts, and spectra from laboratory instrumentation, proper identification to show the specific material and batch tested, a record of all calculations performed in connection with the test, including, for example, units of measure, conversion factors, and equivalency factors, a statement of test results and how they compare with established acceptance criteria, and the signature of the person who performed each test and the date the tests were performed. And the date and signature of the second person showing that the original records have been reviewed for accuracy, completeness, and compliance with established standards. Complete records should also be maintained for any modification to an established analytical method, periodic calibration of laboratory instruments, apparatus, gauges, and recording devices, all stability testing performed on APIs, and out of specification investigations. OOS, out of specification investigations. Now coming to batch production record review. Written procedure should be established and followed for the review and approval of batch production and laboratory control records, including packing and labeling, to determine the compliance of intermediate or API with established specifications before a batch is released or distributed. Batch production and laboratory control records of critical process steps should be reviewed and approved by quality units before an API batch is released or distributed. They must be reviewed and approved by a quality unit before the API batch is released or distributed. Production and laboratory control records of non-critical process steps can be reviewed by qualified production personnel or other units following the procedure approved by the quality unit. Critical steps should be reviewed by person from quality unit, whereas non-critical process steps can be reviewed by qualified production personnel or other units following the procedures approved by the quality unit. All deviations, investigations, and out of specification reports should be reviewed as a part of batch record review before the batch is released. The quality unit can delegate to the production unit the responsibility and authority to release of intermediates except from those shipped outside the control of manufacturing company. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for further videos on pharmaceutical sciences and other related disciplines.